Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Gene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs. Welcome to the Frontline Innovators podcast. I'm your host, Justin Lake, and I am super excited about today's episode because I have an absolutely special guest on today's show. Today's guest develops and delivers curriculum on the art and practice of small business consulting. He is also a contributor to industry publications and has spoken at many conferences worldwide on project management, pricing, and knowledge workers. That's a very important phrase that we're probably going to talk about on the show. He also hosts the Sage Advice podcast, which has several hundred episodes published over many years. And then most importantly for me, this is the one that I listen to the most. He also co-hosts the VoiceAmerica Talk Show Network's The Soul of Enterprise with his dear friend, Ron Baker. I highly encourage you to check out that show. In the meantime, on our show, please welcome Ed Kless. Hello, Ed.
Justin, great to be with you.
The one way I didn't describe you, but I'm going to now, is that you are my brother-in-law's brother-in-law, which I think
brother-in-law is once removed. That's
right. Which I think we've decided officially means absolutely nothing other than we're two guys that happen to live in the same county in Texas.
And share a brother-in-law.
And we share a brother-in-law. And we run into each other at family get-togethers and stuff like that. But you're also a very dear friend and a fantastic mentor. And I'm really excited to introduce you to our listening audience. So let's get started the same way that we do with all of our other guests. And give me your take on what you think is the biggest challenge facing the deskless workforce today.
This is a really good question because in the conversations that you and I have had, I've begun to get a more and more of an appreciation for what these folks do, and I'm going to say it's bringing their humanity to the job. I think that's a challenge for many businesses today, but I think especially for those on the front line, how they need to bring their humanity because they're challenged in all sorts of different directions. From a measurement standpoint, but also a judgment standpoint. And once you dive into the realm of a judgment standpoint, that's where, as you brought up, the term knowledge worker begins to kick in. Because you really can't measure knowledge workers, you can only judge them, and usually by other knowledge workers. So it's the quality of the work, not necessarily the quantity that comes out. And I think that other people having that understanding about them is perhaps the biggest challenge.
I think that's a fantastic way for us to start the show. And I want to come back and talk about a couple of the differences and maybe similarities between what we would traditionally think of as a knowledge worker and what we talk about on our show is the kind of frontline deskless workforce. But before I do that, I want to give our audience an opportunity to understand your background, how you came into the role that you have today. And I would love for you to just give us a few minutes of going all the way back to the consulting firm that you ran earlier on in your career. So tell us a little bit about that and how you ended up where you're at today.
Well, I go back a little bit further to my first gig out of college was at an accounting firm on Long Island. And it was very weird because I was a non-accountant. And this is back in the late 1980s, and I got an office day one, but it really wasn't the office. It was called the computer room, and it had 2 IBM ATs in it, and it was hysterically funny because most of the guys, and they were all guys at the time, who were partners in the firm, refused to cross the threshold. Like they would not come into the room. If they were wanted to talk to me, they would stand like outside the door and just stick their head in because they didn't want to be like associated with a keyboard. I think
they didn't want to get sucked in.
Yeah, it's like, oh no, I don't do keyboard. And the irony, of course, is that I think 4 or 5 years later, when I left the firm, everybody had a computer on their desk or had a laptop or something like that. So it was really a transformative time.
Yeah. And what year was that?
That was 1988. Yeah, early. Okay. That's when I first got the first gig, and I think I was there for I want to say 5 or 6 years or so. But where you then went with is the firm that I was a partner in, where we deployed and and it helped implement accounting software back in the, client server days. So it was, everybody remembers that. Yeah. So that was an awful lot of fun. I got crawled around on my hands and knees plugging in coaxial cable for a while, BNC connectors, all kinds of insane technology stuff just to get the accounting system to work. Of course, the one of my fun stories is the time that this guy called me up in absolute panic, screaming that the network was down, it wouldn't work. It was only two computers connected together.
That makes up a network.
That's a network, right? So, and he was just pissed, right, that this whole thing was going down. Well, I finally show up at their office, and what had happened is they had this big safe in the corner, and he had closed the safe door, and it had cut the cable. It well, not gonna work when this is the case.
That's definitely going to impact the quality of the network.
That's the electrons can't jump. They don't have that capability yet. So he was mad at me for it, and then when he realized that it was something that he had done, which is close this big safe door on the cable,
he got quiet.
Yeah, he got quiet really quickly. But there were just it was a really good time in the industry that I was in, because we were moving a lot of folks from green bar paper and T accounts all the way up to the first computerized accounting systems, and it was really interesting to see how people reacted, and in a lot of ways what you're talking about, the frontline worker, was in effect the AP clerk, the AR clerk of days of yore. They were on the front line. They all had to go to the office. And by the way, there's my brief definition of understanding knowledge workers, and it really is lacking, is that knowledge workers, instead of having to bring their coffee to the office, can bring their office to the coffee.
I love that.
Right? And but it's really a bit of a misnomer, because the folks that I was working with, they were knowledge workers, but they still had to bring their coffee to the office, because they were tethered to this thing called a computer that had to be, at the time, plugged in, and certainly had multiple cables running to it. Whereas what has allowed knowledge workers to untether from that has been, Wi-Fi and those kinds of things.
Yeah. Did you use the term digital transformation back then? Was that widely used? I mean, that's really what that was.
Yeah, no, I don't, I think the first time I heard digital transformation was about 5 years ago.
Yeah. Isn't that funny? Because really, probably more then than now. I mean, that was really transformative. This was really going from purely analog, paper-based world into really the first experience of digital. But yet that term seems to have come up. I think the big analyst firms have promoted that term over the last few years. But what you were doing back at that phase in the early 90s was really more of a digital transformation in many ways.
Well, there's a lot of fun stuff going on. I remember we had these Oki Data 2410 printers. Remember those things, right?
I don't remember that model, but I do remember Oki Data for sure.
These were big-ass printers that were usually on stands with green bar paper and stuff. But what's really cool about it is, that was a big moment in the implementation, is when you fired that sucker up and it started, because it would shake and man, you knew work was getting done now, and there were invoices flying out of this sucker at lightning speed, and you're like, yeah. Now it's kind of uneventful now. Do you hit send?
Yeah. Well, and it's actually funny to think about what you just said, right? We're putting in all this technology back then so that you could print more stuff on paper.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe that is part of the transformation that we've experienced now, is that, we're truly trying to get rid of the paper, not just getting rid of handwritten paper, but we're actually trying to get rid of paper entirely.
Yes. Well, there's a great story that's involved in that. Was this implementation that I did somewhere in New Jersey. And they had the process. What we were going, actually, I was taking them from a computerized system to a new system. So they had already been computerized for quite some time, and this has got to be probably the late 90s or so. And I'm going through their workflow, and they had this 4-part invoice. So it was, carbonless paper, 4-part invoices. And so the white copy was sent to the customer. The pink copy was filed numerically. The blue copy was put someplace else, and then or went with the customer file. And then there was a gray copy that went in a box. And they had shifted from the Oki Data 2410 dot matrix printer to laser printers, and then were making copies on different color paper. Right, so they would they would print out the white copy, then they would have to put in blue paper, and then put in pink paper, and then did the same thing. But remember, gray copy in the box, gray copy in the box. So I'm doing this workflow, and I'm like, well, what's the gray copy in the box for? And then I go, oh, we don't know. It's like one of those classic. So there was this wall of gray copies of boxes and boxes of invoices with gray. So I finally dug down to invoice number 1 or whatever it was. And it was because the sample form that came with their original software was a 4-part form, and they just ordered the 4-part paper
year after year after year.
And then we're physically making copies of it on gray paper. Think about that, like this, they had to buy special gray paper so that they could put it in the box. It's just madness.
I love it. Us humans are kind of funny creatures sometimes.
Wacky stuff. And I'm sure that continues on. And one of the things I learned out of that story, by the way, is when you're documenting a workflow, don't change it while you're documenting it, no matter how stupid it sounds. Because the minute you try to make adjustments to the workflow as you're documenting it, you're gonna screw things up, because you don't know. There may have been a reason for those gray copies. And the allegory is actually a thing called Chesterton's fence, which I only learned about 5 years ago, this thing called Chesterton's fence. And he's a philosopher who said if you buy a piece of property and you're walking through the woods, let's say, and you observe a fence, he says you don't take it down until you understand why it was put up. And I think that's a great notion for some of the stuff that we do. You don't take stuff down until you know why it was put up, even if it's stupid, even if it doesn't seem to make any sense, because there may be a once in 5 year reason for the fence, and you don't know until you find out why it was put up. And my digging for the original invoice was, I finally found why it was put up. It was clearly just a mistake, but there could have been a reason, and we should always make sure that we don't adjust that reason until we know why.
Well, and my takeaway from just that story is just really always asking the why.
Yeah.
Right. When we're analyzing a process like that and looking to automate or perhaps improve that process, we have to understand why and ask the questions. And I know your personality to know that you don't accept anything at face value, and that you're always going to dig into it. But I do think that's how situations with your gray paper story continue to happen, because people are so focused on the job at hand and getting something implemented that they don't ask enough why questions and really seek to understand it, so that they can then look for the opportunities for improvement. And that story was a great example of that.
Yeah.
All right, so I know that over the last decade or more, you have now been involved in conversations around value pricing. You're helping Sage partners advance their business, rethink pricing strategies. Tell me about how you made that transition from working in a consulting practice that was implementing, Microsoft Great Plains, if I remember correctly.
That's correct.
And now all of a sudden not all of a sudden, but over a decade or more, how did you end up doing what you're doing today?
Yeah, I think the thing that happened was I sold my interest in that firm in December of 2001 or 2, something like that, and 2002. And then for the next 18 months, I was doing some consulting. In fact, I had done some consulting for Microsoft as they were transitioning from purchasing this company called Great Plains, based out of Fargo, North Dakota, and then it being really brought into the mothership. And I was on a team that was talking to their partner organizations, like I was formerly. So I had that area of expertise and background. I then got reintroduced to a guy that I had known for years, not well at all, but we had come across each other at Great Plains conferences. This guy named Taylor McDonald, who then was the head of the partner channel for a company called Best, which is now Sage, and he had me do some consulting work, but hired me full-time at Sage, with the whole idea that what he wanted me to do and create a practice area around was this notion of how can we help partners make their businesses better. So I don't get involved in any transactional sales per se. Like there's no commission associated with any software that goes out the door with me. And I'm not going to ask them, how much did you sell this week, this month, this quarter, this year? My question to them is always, what can I help you do to make your business better? And then that led to some conversations with my now co-host Ron Baker about the notion of pricing. I had dabbled with what I didn't know was value pricing, but back in the firm that I was in, where we had done several implementations on what we called a fixed fee. But it was probably more fixed fee than it was truly value price. But Ron wrote this great book called The Professional's Guide to Value Pricing, which is the original. He calls that the Old Testament. The New Testament is his book called Implementing Value Pricing, because the first one's out of print. But and I had read that book, and I had him do a session for us at Sage, and we just hit it off real well, as from not only a business philosophy standpoint, but just the life philosophy kind of thing, and just remained close. And then when he had the opportunity to do this radio show, because he was connected, he was one of the original LinkedIn influencers back when LinkedIn influencer actually meant something.
Yeah.
And had, I don't know, 200,000 followers. And this Voice America got a hold of him, asking him if he wanted to do a radio show for them, because he was an influencer. And then he came to me, and we pitched this idea inside Sage, and that was 8.5 years ago. And here we are at 392 episodes and counting.
That's amazing. So tell our audience a little bit more about your podcast, because I've been a listener over the years. You've had some absolutely outstanding guests on your show, but tell them a little bit about the show, and maybe
including you, by the way. You've been a guest.
I was a guest on the show. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I noticed, I was actually doing some research for today, and I noticed I'm not on your top 10 episode list. So, I'll get a name.
Yeah. It's hard to crack that top 10 list. So
it is. You've had some fantastic, really outstanding guests on the show. So tell us just a little bit about the show, the background, and maybe some of the highlights of some of the guests that you've brought on.
Yeah, this notion show is called The Soul of Enterprise, and it's meant to invoke this, and it's SOUL, not like sole of your shoe, but SOUL, and it's meant to inspire people to have the understanding that business has a spiritual, if not necessarily religious, component to it. And spiritual is, I use that term loosely. It's ethereal. There's an essence to business that is not just about the material. And in fact, the show opens with a quote from Ronald Reagan. And it's not because, Ron, my radio partner, is a huge Ronald Reagan fan. I mean, I'm okay with Ronald Reagan. But he gave this speech at Moscow State University when Gorbachev was starting to change things over there. This is obviously before the fall of the Berlin Wall. But where he calls it, speaks of the economy and mind, in which there are no bounds on human creativity, and the freedom to create is the most precious natural resource. So this notion that bringing our knowledge and applying our humanity to the stuff that we do, to the material, is what can create an inordinate amount of value. And our show is dedicated to understanding this economy and mind. Because it really is, when it comes down to it, all work is knowledge work. All work is knowledge work, because it's human innovation and creativity and knowledge that we apply to physical things, to matter. Thomas Sowell, who's been a guest on the show, a great economist, makes the point that all of the material that is around us existed when the Neanderthals were here. The material for the computers that you and I are talking on, our pen, the paper, the microphones, the wall behind us, the books, all of that material was here. And it's just been human innovation, creativity, and knowledge that have transformed that matter into the stuff that we have. So all knowledge, or all things are knowledge workers. All people are knowledge workers, because it's the application of that.
There's so many profound connections to the things that we normally talk about on the show. And in that, thinking about digital transformation initiatives, implementing technology with the men and women on the front lines, they often feel very threatened by the implementation of that technology. And I think, my colleague, Gene Signorini, has often said that, frontline workers are knowledge workers too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's also interesting to me is that while the knowledge or the frontline workers often feel threatened by the technology, a big part of the value to them with the technology is to take away monotonous, repetitive tasks so that they can focus on the things that only humans can do. And unfortunately, we do an absolutely crappy job of explaining that part to many of those men and women, right? And so they're left feeling the threat of automation and the threat of that technology. And they miss that the real opportunity is here for the component of their work that does depend on their knowledge and their personality and their intuition and their customer facing abilities and things like that. And, but unfortunately, because we tend to do a bad job of communicating the why behind the tech implementation, they end up just being threatened by it instead. Mm-hmm. And it's really unfortunate because there's a real opportunity if we can all do better jobs as implementers of that technology of helping them understand that it's actually an opportunity for them to elevate their role, not dismiss their capabilities. I think we'd all be a lot better and they could be more successful in their role.
Yeah, there's a phrase that I've used, and mostly this is with people who are in, say, accounting jobs, but it applies equally, I think, to those folks you're talking about. If your job can be completely replaced by a bot or a robot, your job pretty much sucks.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
It's not that you suck. It's just that the job is extraordinarily difficult or challenging. And Mike Rowe has got this great show that he's done for years, this Dirty Job Stuff. But if you look at every single one of those episodes, you will not only see that, yeah, those jobs are dirty, but there's also a significant amount of knowledge that has to be brought to them in order to get them right.
Right. And that's what we need to do a better job of as we are implementing these solutions, is helping them understand that this is an opportunity to elevate their role, to really bring out the knowledge that they have and not make them feel like the tech is going to replace them. You have a story that I want to make sure that we don't run out of time, because you and I can sit and talk forever and never get to one of the stories.
As we have previously.
We have done that many times before, but we weren't recording in those times.
That's true.
So I know you have a story from in your past that is just very relevant to the types of stories we like to hear on the show. So tell us about Frank and give us a little bit about that background here.
Frank, the story of Frank. So I was doing an implementation at a wine store in Manhattan, and they had a warehouse in Brooklyn. And Frank was the head of the warehouse in Brooklyn. Now, Frank was you may remember this, Justin, that there was a time when NFL had this thing called the taxi squad, which was, these were guys who kept in shape and would practice with the team. And if the third string guy got hurt, they would literally put you in a taxi and drive you to the game and you would play. So Frank was on the taxi squad when he was younger, not where he was now, but for the Giants, for the New York Giants back in probably the late 50s or 60s. Big dude, like 6'3", I mean, 300, a big guy. He was warehouse manager that moved cases of wine all over the place. That's where he got this job. Well, he ended up, being the warehouse manager. And we're doing this implementation, and so he had to do one thing in the computer system, and that is an inventory transfer. So if wine needed to be transferred from the warehouse to the store or be accepted back, maybe they had too much at the store, had to come back in. So he had to do an inventory transfer, which, if you've worked with any systems, you know that this is 5 pieces of information. That's it. It's the easiest transaction because there's no ultimate effect on like the general ledger or anything. There's no accounting. It's debit inventory, credit inventory. There's nothing that is really happening. But you have to be able to transfer this stuff. So the 5 pieces of information are, number one, the date, which is usually today.
Right.
There's the thing that you got to move, which is the item number, right? There's what warehouse did it come from, which in their case, was only 2. It was either coming from the store or going to the store. There's only 2. And then where was it going to? And again, it was the opposite, right? And then the third one was, how many things are you moving?
Quantity.
Quantity. Yeah. What quantity of the things that you're moving? Okay. You could literally teach a horse probably like how to do this transfer. Like if it 3 3. Okay, right. So we could make that happen, right?
I might challenge the horse, but that's a separate conversation.
Yeah. But Frank, I would get call after call from Frank. Ed, how do you do the inventory transfer? Because it didn't happen every day. It happened, maybe a couple times a week max. Ed, how do you do the inventory? And first time, I would show him, and then he would write it down. I'm like, Frank, where are the notes that you wrote? I lost them. All right, so now I'm like typing out notes for him. This is going to help. Yeah, Frank is a guy who has his username and password on the sticky note on the monitor. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, Frank, the password's your daughter's name. I mean, it's really, you're not. I don't know if how you're gonna forget that, man, but okay. But right. So Frank, and it was really got to know. It was like, how do you do it? How do you do over and over and over again? And so finally, and in fact, I'm reading this book, which is now my go-to Bible by Peter Block, called "The Answer to How Is Yes." And in this he tells a story. When somebody's asking you over and over again, how do you do it? It's not that they're stupid. It's not that they don't know how to do it. It's that they don't want to do it. And there's a difference. And if you keep telling them how to do it over and over again, you're not helping them. You're not helping them. Because it's just they are just then made to feel that they don't have the knowledge. So what you have to do is you have to confront them with the reality of the situation. So what I said to Frank was, Frank, I know you to be a smart person. You can get to be the warehouse manager here because you're an idiot. Clearly, this is just something you don't want to do. And Frank, like, physically moved back, and which I was happy because he could have crushed me. Like, he like reached out,
physically,
wring my neck. I was probably 40 pounds lighter at the time, right? And Frank probably knew people that I would never have been found. I'm just saying. But then I saw it leave his body. Like I saw his shoulders like drop, and he took a breath and he said, "You're right. You're right." And then I started asking him questions. I said, "Well, Frank." Well, actually before that he said, "Ed, I thought I was going to be able to retire before I had to use a computer system." That's the exact words. And I said, "Well, Frank, how old are you?" 57. "When are you going to retire?" 65. I'm not a math major, Frank, but that's 8 years from now. And do you think that this company is not going to implement this software for 8 years? Do you think you'd be able to hold out for 8 years? He's like, "No." So, well, what do you want to do? And then there was another pause and another, probably a little bit longer. And he said, "I'm ready now. Could you show me one more time?" And I showed him. And Frank became the king of the inventory transfer. Like he literally ran around going, "I need inventory to transfer. Get me, I am a king of inventory transfer."
You couldn't get enough of it.
Couldn't get enough of it because it wasn't the fact that he didn't know how to do it, or it's that he didn't want to. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until we literally had this breakthrough, a breakthrough in neural pathways, that he was able to accept, okay, yeah, I can do this, and I will remember, and I will learn how. It wasn't his incapacity to do it. It was his own resistance, self-resistance, that was blocking him, and there was no way that I could, quote, train him out of that.
Yep. Because
what I learned from that is that adult humans cannot be trained. Adult humans are educated, and there's a difference between those two words. I don't like calling anything that we do training. There's potty training, which is for children. There's dog training and horse training. But adult humans are educated, and educate, the word educare, it is a Latin word, and it comes from the same words as extrude. Education means to draw out of, not to stuff crap into. So what we're doing is, when we're educating humans, the understanding that what we're trying to do is we're drawing out of them the knowledge and insight that they already have, and the gifts that they bring. In fact, one of the other things that I learned from Peter Block is to ask this question. It sounds like a really bizarre question to ask during a technology implementation. But early on, you ask all of the people, what gifts do you bring to this implementation? And people are like, gifts? Yeah, gifts. What are the gifts that you have that you're bringing to this implementation? And that's the thing that we were talking about earlier, that insight, that knowledge, that humanity that they apply. Because they have stuff in there that no technologist has ever thought of.
And so I love that you're bringing that, that you make that point, because it just speaks to the fact that most of the time when we're implementing technology, we're trying to implement something to automate the most menial tasks, transactional type of tasks. And there's such a great opportunity for the human side to come out, but we don't talk about that enough when we're implementing. So I love this suggestion right here. What gifts do you bring to this implementation would allow them to draw out? Well, I have to interact with the customer. Well, I'm the one that's talking to the customer, when this thing is happening. Great. Tell us more about that. What are you doing in that conversation? And how can us implementing this technology give you more time to do what you do best, and less time on, tracking the specifics of inventory and going to track the paperwork, right? Whatever that case may be.
Yep. And this is something that Peter Drucker brought up all the time in his writing, and I think it's so profound. And when I see instances of it, it makes me crazy. And that is, systems should serve people, not people serve the systems. And that's everyone. That's these frontline workers. That's the folks in the payables department, and who are oftentimes there's very sophisticated accounting type systems where the whole purpose is for the people to serve the system, and that makes me insane.
Yeah, agreed. That's a really interesting quote from Drucker, and I'm glad you brought that up. I want to go back. You talked about this the book, The Answer to How is Yes, with Peter Block. Is that one you're currently reading? That's a current?
No.
Okay,
I read that book as I was working with Frank, so
gotcha,
it was a suggestion that had come from the book. I said, well, let me try this out.
Okay. I mean, it sounds like that material, just based on the quick example that you just provided, would that content still be something that me and others in our audience should still be reading today? Is that Peter Block book still something you'd recommend?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's his best book. He's got a lot of books, but Flawless Consulting is another good one. But The Answer to How is Yes, I think, is his best book. And it's just it's a book that contrasts these, what he calls how-based questions versus what he calls yes or what matters questions. And understanding that the how-based questions are a defense mechanism against change. When people ask a series of how questions, how long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? How do you get those people to change? How have others done it successfully? How do you do it? All of those questions are intended to, not consciously, they're oftentimes subconscious, but they're intended to block the potentiality of change. And Block says, and I think this is just brilliant, the problem is that when these questions are ready, asked and answered too early in the process. So the askers of the questions often don't realize that that's what they're doing, that they're setting up a potential block for change. But the problem is the so-called experts, the so-called consultants, who answer them, and you as the consultant need to say, we're not going to talk. No, we're not answering. And how do you transform? Forget digital transformation. How do you linguistically transform the question away from the how-based question to the what matters question?
Yeah, I can tell you that that's probably something I am most guilty of, and I think that in the example that you just provided with the consultants answering the question too early in the process, I'm definitely guilty of that. And it's only because I want to help. It's because I'm often proud that I have the answer, you know, and I really want to help. But I think what you just said reminds me that sometimes the best thing that we can do is pause for a minute and really think about, why they're asking that question. And I love the point that you just made, that it's not necessarily something that they're consciously trying to put up blocks.
No, they're not Mr. Burns, how can I make this implementation fail? Right. That's not what they're thinking. They are thinking very practical. All of those how questions are extraordinarily practical. They're not dumb questions. They're really practical. And Justin, I would say this, you've experienced one that I know on a regular basis you transform, and that is when you as a salesperson you're asked, how much is this going to cost?
Right.
You move off of that one, don't you?
Yeah.
Right, because I'd first need to pivot to understand what the value is to you before I can understand what the cost is going to be.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one of them, and that's one of those transformations.
Yeah. Well, one of my old guy that I used to read and listen to a lot, named Brian Tracy, used to talk about as it relates to pricing, and my current customers have probably heard me say something along these lines. I don't quote him verbatim, but it's not going to cost you anything unless we can help you find more value than what the price of the solution is, right? Mm-hmm. Because then I'm not going to ask you to buy it.
Yeah. Right.
So that is not to deflect from a very important question, which is what is price. Correct. But is this the right time and is this the right context for us to have that conversation? And I think as we're implementing with people who are, particularly those who are anxious about it, and I think what I think about when you're telling that example from Block's book is sometimes the most difficult people on the receiving end actually, they're not necessarily trying to be difficult, but they ask, as you said, really good questions that are maybe even legitimate questions. And so it gets kind of hard to defend, like, well, why shouldn't we be, like, he's asking good things or she's asking great things. Like, I understand why they would want to know those things. But it's those people that also come off, especially in a group forum, as being just difficult and, as if they're trying to just push back for the sake of pushing back. And I think that does affect the dynamics on an implementation. Well,
and that's the difference between people who are being actively resistant. So Frank in the story was actively resistant.
Right.
And so the Blockian corresponding question to Frank's question, which is how do you do it, is, of course, what refusal are you postponing? So in other words, what is it that you're refusing to do that's getting in the way of you learning this? So there's a direct connection to that. Yeah.
Okay. I looked up some of the blog posts that you had done in the past, and I had missed this one previously, but I had a chance to read it in preparation for today. And I think it really speaks to something that we talk a lot about on the show, which is about empathy. And we have a lot of change management professionals that have been on the show and that listen to this podcast as well. Change management folks are really thinking about, the people side of change. So when we talk about digital transformation, we think a lot about the technology, and we think a lot about the ones and zeros, flying through cyberspace correctly. The change management professionals that are listening are also focused on the human element of that change. And so we often talk about empathy, and that comes across as, very caring for the individuals. But the real definition of empathy, as you point out in this blog post, is really just about transferring one's, pain to another person. You advocate for thinking of this in terms of compassion versus empathy. And I'm going to link to this blog post. It's a really short blog post, but it's something I think all of our listeners should see. So I'll link to it in the show notes here. But can you tell me your take on empathy versus compassion?
Sure. And this goes back to the fact that my dad was a Latin teacher, and it was like some really weird stuff would happen. You remember My Big Fat Greek Wedding, right, Justin?
Yes.
There's the running gag in that where he goes, give me a word, then I'll tell you how the origin is Greek, and that, right? And he would make up some crazy story about why orange was originally Greek.
Right.
But it was like that in my house growing up, but only with Latin. Like, my dad would break down words. And remember when he talked about the mortgage. Mortgage is a concatenation of two Latin words, mort and gage. Mort means death. Gage means pledge. So a mortgage is a death pledge. So you're like, oh, okay, makes sense now. But so as a result, my curse, if you will, is that I love the understanding of origins of words. And the word empathy is a relatively new word in the English language. It only entered as part of Gestalt philosophy in the 1920s and 30s in Germany, which, just take yourself through 20s and 30s in Germany, and, there's crazy things happen in Germany in 20s.
For sure.
It means in suffering. The EM means in, and the pathos means suffering. So it's in suffering, and it was meant to describe people who were in suffering with other people. The famous phrase it's kind of entered into our vocabulary, and where Bill Clinton at one point has this, "I feel your pain," right? So I feel your pain. Well, that's actually not very good, because that's a problem. Like if I actually feel somebody else's pain, all we have now is two people in pain. We don't have this. So and I think when people say empathy, what they really mean is compassion. The pathos is still there. That's suffering, but the COM means with. So to be with someone while they are going through their suffering, with them in their suffering, as opposed to feeling their suffering in their suffering, is two different things. And I think what we really want is people who are compassionate, to the point now where, and I may lose this battle in the long run, where dictionaries are now changing the way they describe empathy to meaning compassion. So there's, and words do change their meanings. I understand that, but I also think that sometimes using a word that's, first of all, I think better, but also is slightly out of context, like using gift. Like, you don't hear gift in a business context very often. Using compassion instead of empathy, because empathy has now become a buzzword. It's just empathy. Well, you have to have empathy, and it just flies over you and doesn't mean anything anymore. And whereas if you say now compassion, you need to show people compassion. I think that makes them pause and say, I don't. That's a word I don't often hear in this context. So I think it enhances our ability to change. One of the Werner Erhard, who is the founder of EST, the weird guy, very weird dude, but he says all change is linguistic. All change is linguistic. It's about changing the words that we use. So I think in fact one of the things that Ron and I talk about if we're doing engagements, helping people move to value pricing, is we're listening for them to start to use our language. And that's a big marker for me. Like when people start to use the language that I use rather than the language that they brought, then I know they're beginning to make the change. So we often say, change language. Like change client to customer. Change fee to price. There's lots of these words that we should be substituting, and I think empathy and compassion qualify as well.
Yeah. As when you talked about, Bill Clinton saying that quote, I think one of the challenges in particular with the men and women on the front lines is that they listen to the rest of us that have, kind of corporate jobs working in a cushy air-conditioned office and say, how the hell can you ever feel my pain? Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things that really struck me the most about compassion. I actually think a lot of the guests that we've had on our show, I do believe they have genuine compassion for the men and women that they're serving inside their organizations. But I think the point you made is one I agree with, which is that it's not a term that's commonly used in a corporate context. It actually sounds kind of, I don't know, maybe it sounds too warm and fuzzy for the
touchy-feely California sit in a hot tub BS.
It does, right?
Kumbaya.
But also, and we've said this a lot in the show, words matter. And I do think that it matters to really think about, are we trying to feel their pain? No, we're not trying to feel their pain, but we are trying to understand it. And I think that's what's most powerful, so that we can help them then be successful despite this change that we're asking them to absorb. And I think compassion is a much better word to think about. Go ahead.
And let me, and it's not even understand, because even understanding of the pain, I think, is a problem. See, the compassion is, I am with them in their suffering. I don't pretend that I can feel your pain. I don't pretend that I can even fully understand it. But I can be with you. I can be present with you That's what it means. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And then hopefully for the folks that are helping to implement this change, they can take that learning back and somehow find a way to make that change less uncomfortable for the men and women on the receiving end of that, and hopefully allow them to be more successful, which is really the theme of what this show is all about.
Yep. Amen.
Awesome. And our time flies, whether we're on a podcast or sitting at a restaurant having a drink or whatever we may be doing. But I really, really appreciate you coming on the show today. This has just been absolutely fantastic to have you as a guest. And I think we need to do this more often.
Well, truly my honor and pleasure, Justin.
Well, thank you for doing that. For our audience, I do need to wrap it up there. So I hope you found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. I am going to make a few references in the show notes, make sure that we put Ed's LinkedIn profile in there and a link to the podcast that he hosts. In particular, I highly recommend The Soul of Enterprise. I think many of our listeners would really enjoy that show. So please take a moment to go check it out. Quick reminder, the podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. Visit the website at skyllful.com. And if you or someone you know is out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your story or their story. And let's see about getting you or them on the show as a guest. Thanks again. And Ed, thank you for participating today.